Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's an honor and privilege to speak today on this important update to the Canadian Broadcasting Act. It has been 29 years since there has been an update to this legislation, and it's long overdue. I graduated from Algonquin College Broadcasting Program the same year that the Broadcasting Act was last updated in 1991, and I've seen many changes in the field since that time. I'm a big supporter of Canadian content rules. It's important to have platforms and spaces where diverse voices and stories can be shared. I've seen firsthand how CanCon system has benefited Canadians. During the 1990s, I worked at Video In Studios, which is now called Vivo Media Arts. It's an artist-run center that provides access to equipment and training to video artists and media producers. I trained a lot of people in the new digital technology of that time. Many of those people did not see themselves reflected in the mainstream content being produced. Indigenous people, people with diverse abilities, people of color, street-involved youth, and members of the LGBTQ++ community. Many of these people I trained went on to develop careers in the broadcasting industry and utilized CanCon rules to bring their unique stories and perspectives to Canadian audiences. In the late 1990s, I worked with Dana Claxton, a renowned First Nations artist. Her sister, Kim Sue Goodtrack, was a teacher who had written a children's book called The ABCs of Our Spiritual Connection, which threads together First Nations spiritual beliefs from across North America. Kim had an idea for a TV show, and together with Dana and their brother Don, I co-produced the pilot for Wankaja. It was the first preschool show on a brand new Canadian television network, the Aboriginal People's Television Network, or APTN. We made 64 episodes of that series before going on to create 39 episodes of a preteen show for APTN called Art Zone. While these shows were targeted to an audience of children and youth, the cultural sharing and stories provided an education for people of all ages. This programming would not have been possible without CanCon rules. Funding formulas are essential to ensure a diversity of content. If it was left solely to the market, we would have nothing but Disney-style caricatures of Indigenous culture, and many uniquely Canadian stories would never be produced for film and television. This bill is an effort to catch up with the new media reality that has been unfolding for the last 2 decades. In 2007, I uploaded my first video to YouTube. It was footage I shot of 3 undercover Sûreté de Quebec police officers trying to provoke an attack on their own riot squad at a protest in Montebello, Quebec. We pulled the masks off their faces, and when they were mock arrested by their fellow officers, we noticed that all of their boots matched those of the riot squad. The YouTube video went viral and became an international news story. YouTube has evolved into one of the most influential players in the media landscape, and we have barely begun grappling with the implications of that. One thing that Canadians really want to see is the internet giants, Facebook, Google, and Amazon, paying their fair share of taxes for the business that they do in this country. They should be paying not just the GST and HST on the advertising they sell in this market, but corporate taxes on the income they generate from Canadians. One key thing that this bill does is create a new category of broadcasting under the Act, the online undertaking. This will ensure that the online streaming giants such as Amazon and Netflix are covered under the Act. This will help to level the playing field. These multinational companies selling their services in Canada should be required to carry Canadian content and/or help to pay for the creation of Canadian content. Madam Speaker, the health of our news media is another area of great concern, particularly local news outlets. Local news outlets cannot compete on a level playing field with companies like Facebook and Google. We need local media and the stories they cover in our communities. Their content is shared on social media platforms who sell advertising beside that content, but none of that revenue is shared with them. Our local media outlets are held to journalistic standards, but the social media platforms are not. This is another glaring omission. Social media platforms are publishers who generate enormous profits from content. Content which is often racist, homophobic, misogynist, and misleading. Social media companies should be required to uphold the same standards as traditional broadcasters. The absence of these standards and the expectations of voluntary self-regulation has brought us to a place where social media is negatively impacting our mental health, creating deepening divisions in society, and having a corrosive effect on democracy. We must take steps to ensure the survival of local media outlets in a media landscape where the playing field will never be level. Taxing social media companies on the revenue they generate in Canada and directing a portion of those funds to support local media production would be one way of doing so. Madam Speaker, the Broadcasting Act should not limit the definition of broadcasting, but should leave it to the CRTC to determine what should be regulated. As we've seen in the last few decades, the media landscape continues to shift, and the CRTC needs to be able to regulate emerging types of media dissemination. The CRTC should not just have the option to regulate internet giants, they must be mandated to do so. The penalties for violation by these internet giants also need to be substantial, so as not just viewed as the cost of doing business. There are concerns about the removal of the paragraph that reads in part, the Canadian broadcasting system shall be effectively owned and controlled by Canadians. I understand that the government is trying to bring the multinational internet giants under the Act, but we also need to ensure that our existing broadcast system is not opened up to foreign ownership. As I emphasized earlier, the requirements for Canadian content are important. There are lots of American productions shot in Canada using Canadian talent, but these are not Canadian stories. I know we cannot expect Disney Plus to create Canadian content based on Canadian stories, but they should be required to help fund Canadian content based on the amount of content they stream into the Canadian market. Spotify does not create content, but they should be required to identify Canadian content on their streaming platforms, and they should also have to contribute to CanCon based on the amount of business they do in this country. Canadians need to be able to find Canadian content on these large streaming platforms. Companies like Netflix, Amazon, and Spotify should provide the means for users to easily find Canadian content. The Broadcasting Act must continue to protect the unique linguistic characteristics of Canada. We need to ensure that broadcasters create content in both official languages. Original French language content should not be sidelined by English language programs that have voiceover translations, which are then passed off as French language content. Bill C-10 proposes to replace the current conditions of license with conditions of service to prohibit the appeal of any conditions of service to the Cabinet. The public must have the right to appeal a CRT decision that it considers unfair. While every decision of the CRTC should not necessarily be up for appeal, the process for appealing to Cabinet should be retained in the Act. To summarize, Madam Speaker, this bill introduces changes to the Broadcast Act that I'm happy to see, but there are changes to the Act that leave many stakeholders concerned. Some of the issues can be fixed with amendments. Some of the issues I've raised can only be addressed through regulation. Some can only be addressed through additional legislation, including proper taxation of the multinational digital media giants. Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, I will be voting for this bill at second reading, and I look forward to hearing what the witnesses have to say in the committee process. Finally, Madam Speaker, I would like to take this opportunity to wish you, the House of Commons staff, my honourable colleagues here in the House of Commons, my constituents, and all Canadians a happy and healthy holiday season. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I appreciate many of the comments that the member has stated through his speech, and I want to pick up on something that I've provided already some comment on, and that's in regards to just how important the legislation is in terms of looking forward and how media has actually changed over the years and the necessity for us to be going into the area of the internet in this fashion. Protecting Canadian content is, for many different reasons that the member cited, critically important for us as a nation. I wonder if you could just provide some additional thoughts in terms of just the impact it also has on jobs. Quite significant number of jobs, and it also feeds hope for a lot of many talented Canadians from coast to coast to coast.
The honourable member for Nanaimo Ladysmith.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank the honourable Parliamentary Secretary for his question. I, of course, have worked in the broadcast industry and as an independent producer, and I know that there's a lot of production that comes into Canada from the United States that helps to pay for the infrastructure and develops the talent of Canadians, and that talent and that infrastructure is then used for Canadian content. And it's really important to nurture that Canadian talent and make sure that unique stories are told. I'm really happy to see, for instance, Eden Robinson create Monkey Beach into a film. And so I'm happy to see this development and this protection of Canadian content in this legislation.
And comments? The honourable member for Flamborough-Glanbrook.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I want to ask the member, this bill is 38 pages. It covers amendments to the Canada Elections Act, the Referendum Act, the Copyright Act, the Cannabis Act, the Access to Information Act, Accessible Canada Act, and the Broadcasting Act. And I read the entire bill today. I noticed that the vast majority of pages define and lay out how different offences will be prosecuted. I'm just wondering if the member has a concern about the ground that's trying to be covered in such a minimalistic bill and the nature of how we actually put some, lack of better words, heft to this so that the House of Commons actually has some control in developing this new regimen rather than it all being in the CRTC's hands.
The honourable member for Nanaimo Ladysmith.
Oh, thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank the honourable member for his question. I think that it's really important to cover a lot of different ground with this act because broadcasting affects all of our lives. The internet is affecting our elections. It's influencing our children. Could be an educational influence, but it can also be a detrimental influence. As I was saying, it undermines our democracy. It undermines our community strength. It can be divisive. So there is a need to cover a lot of ground in this bill, and I think that there's more ground that needs to be covered. I'm looking forward to the committee process to hear what the experts have to say.
We have time for a brief question. The honourable member for South Okanagan, West Kootenay.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member for his speech. Just wondering if he could comment on, I'm not sure if he heard the question from my colleague from Courtney Alberni with the last speaker, but this idea of Canadian content, news content that's put onto Facebook by Canadian newspapers that are struggling to stay afloat, and Facebook gets that content for free, basically. And the Australians have a solution for this that they're putting forward. I'm just wondering if he's aware of that and whether he could comment on it.
The honourable member for Nanaimo Ladysmith has less than a minute to respond.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank the honourable member for his question. As I mentioned in my speech, we do need to work on creating a more level playing field. It's going to be hard for local media to compete with these internet giants, but the Australian model is something that we should be looking at. And as I mentioned in my speech, we need to make sure that the content that is shared through these social media platforms and has advertising right beside it, there needs to be revenue sharing there. There needs to be a system of fairness. We need to protect our local media sources and the important stories that they tell because they are extremely important to our community, they're important to our democracy, and they're important to our identity as Canadians.